Hi, everyone. I'm Derek Thompson, staff writer for The Atlantic. Thanks so much for coming back to Office Hours. Today, we have a very special Office Hours for you. We're going to talk a little bit about the abundance agenda. We're going to talk about housing. And here with me to talk about housing, we have one of our best staff writers, our very best staff writer on the issue of housing, and that is Jerusalem Demsis. Hi, Jerusalem. How are you?
Hi, Derek. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So Jerusalem and I are going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that she's been writing about, why it's so hard to build sufficient housing in America, what some of the bottlenecks are to building housing in America. And throughout this, we want to get your questions and want to make sure that we get to as many of your questions as possible. So it's basically going to work like this. Jerusalem and I are going to talk for maybe 15-ish minutes about her work and some of my ideas about how to increase housing abundance. And then we're going to answer your questions about how to build more housing in America and this wacky real estate market that we're all trying to figure out. So first off, Jerusalem, big picture question. I've written about what I call the abundance agenda, this idea that it's important for us to focus on the things we want to make more of in America. We want more capacity for healthcare. We want more energy. We want more science and technology that serves the good. We also very fundamentally want more housing. Talk to me a little bit about why you think housing is such a fundamental issue, not just in my abundance agenda, but in your own vision of progress.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the first thing is just everyone needs a house. It's just a fundamental thing about living is that you need shelter. I think it's a prerequisite for accessing a lot of other important rights that we think are really valuable, whether it's wanting to make sure your kids go to a good school. Like, how do you go to school if you don't have a house that you feel safe in, that there's a good quality, that you don't feel like there's like lead paint in the walls, maybe poisoning your kids? Like, it's a really big deal when you're thinking about people's physical health, their mental health, their access to their community and building close ties. All of these things really rest on the idea that you have a house that you feel safe in, that you feel you're not, you don't feel a lot of precarity around whether or not you're gonna be able to stay there. And so I think housing abundance is really important because what you want is you don't want it to be a world where, everyone's fighting over a small number of houses, or even, you want to go get a new job in a new city, or you want to move to be near your family, or you're just a kid who's flying the nest and you want more options. We want to make sure that for anyone who wants it, that there are just tons of options available to them, not that they're constrained by a housing stock that was not built for their generation or was not built for their time of life. I mean, this is a big deal for not just young people, but also seniors who might be like aging out of their house and can't even use their second floor anymore.
Yeah, I've said before that I'll sometimes have conversations with older couples who will say, I don't really like all this construction that's happening around me. Like, there's all this noise, there's all this new traffic. And then I'm like, so how are your kids or grandkids doing with trying to find a house in the area? And they're like, it's impossible. There's no houses. And so it's so interesting how this works out intergenerationally, where sometimes sort of the nimbyism of older generations conflicts with the housing needs of younger generations. Big picture, really quick answer here. How's the US doing in terms of housing abundance? Like, I don't want to make it as maybe simplistic as a grade, but if you feel comfortable going there, what grade would you give the US in terms of providing sufficient housing for Americans?
Not good. It's not a good grade. I don't know if we want to grade it against other countries, because obviously other countries have different constraints, but given how wealthy the United States is, it should not be difficult for us to have housing abundance. We have the money to do so. We have the space to do so. We're just not doing it.
So let's talk about why. I had a podcast interview on my show recently, Plain English, where I said that making the world better on the supply side requires that people like you and me be bottleneck detectives. Like, to really understand what's holding back something like housing, we can't just lead with ideology. We have to be a bit of a detective, like to look metro by metro, place by place, and say, what is holding back housing here? So let's be bottleneck detectives and talk about one of the most important bottlenecks to housing abundance, and that is zoning rules and regulations. Talk a little bit about zoning rules and regulations and how they hold back housing in America.
Sure. So just to kind of level set for people, like, zoning rules and regulations are essentially these laws that determine what kinds of housing can be built and where. These things can range from things like minimum lot sizes. So it says like the lot of land that a single unit of housing can occupy has to be, 5,000 acres or 10,000 acres, or no, that's way too high, 1 acre or 2 acres or 10,000 square feet. And it kind of just depends on what your locality does. And these are set often by very, very local governing bodies, like city councils, or in town meeting cities, it's like your local crier or whatever, the whatever New England is doing up there. And these laws essentially are inflating the cost of housing. And I want to just kind of like break this down really simply is just like, imagine if you're a developer and you're trying to build something. What you do is if you're in like a world without zoning regulations, you would look at the area that you're building in, you would figure out what the demand is for that housing, and you would build housing that would meet that demand. What zoning regulations do is say they get in between what the demand is and what the regulator then, what the developer wants to do, and says, oh, the only thing you're allowed to build are these types of housing. So even if the demand says, 10,000 people want to live in Manhattan this year, new people are coming in, they want to live in Manhattan, but you're only allowed to build housing that's sufficient for 5,000 new people, then that means that developers are really cramped on what they can build. And so that's what zoning regulations do. And that what leads to higher prices, right? Because what ends up happening is those 10,000 people are all vying for 5,000 spots. And I'm sure everyone here has kind of seen these absurdly long lines for people trying to rent apartments in New York City or in Los Angeles. And these are not like people who don't have a lot of money. These are often people who are on the higher end of the income ladder. And when you see things like that, what that means is that scarcity that's being created by these zoning regulations is not just impacting people at the high end of the income ladder, but it's creating a bunch of problems for people lower down who don't get that kind of attention, people who are often crowding multiple families into very small units in places with high demand. And so that's what zoning regulations do.
Before you joined the Atlantic, I knew about zoning regulations, I knew about zoning rules and how they constricted the availability of housing in a lot of different metros. Something I didn't know about that you really educated me on is this thing called citizen voice. You wrote this article that quoted these George Washington University professors, Brooks and Yale law professor Zachary Liskow, who were looking at highway projects. And this mystery of why it's gotten so much more expensive, 3 times more expensive between the 1960s and the 1980s to build a highway, to build interstate highways. And you elevated this idea called citizen voice that might be responsible for the escalating price of building highways. Now, first, when people hear citizen voice, they're probably like, that doesn't sound so bad. Citizens, a good thing. Voice, sounds like democracy. What is citizen voice, and why is it also an ingredient in rising housing costs?
Yeah, and that paper is a really good one. But so essentially, citizen voice refers to the increase in around the 1970s of both citizen groups that started proliferating that were trying to engage with the development process and maybe block developments that they found undesirable for various reasons. And secondly, the form of government that is receptive to that voice and allowing for that to become a veto. There's obviously nothing inherently wrong with people making their opinions known. I don't think 2 opinion writers would get up there and say that was wrong in any way. But I think the question is just, how do our political institutions mediate that voice? How do they respond to the fact that people are speaking up? And also, who is given access to get to speak up? And so there's a lot of citizen voice. Basically, the way that it acts is there's multiple different things, but to keep it sort of brief, it's just kind of like we have a situation where if someone wants to protest a new housing development in their area, a new homeless shelter, someone putting up solar panels across the street on their house, anything like that, there are so many avenues for them to take where their disagreement becomes a veto. And it can be something where it's just one person, it could be 10 people, it could mean that the benefit that a new rail line that's going to build is going to create so much economic activity. It's going to allow a lot of people to move easily and freely, especially lower income folks. But because there's always some cost associated with change, there's construction costs. There's maybe it is annoying to you that your view has changed. And that is obviously something that can suck if you bought a house expecting a specific view or something like that. But the question is, how do our government institutions say, okay, some people are going to be harmed by this change, a lot of people are going to be benefited. Why is the answer always to defer towards the people who have some kind of concern? And that's where we are right now.
Yeah, citizen voice is one word you can use for it, or one phrase you can use for it. Another phrase, I think, is Francis Fukuyama's Futocracy, this idea that we are governed not by what is popular, but rather by the loudest veto. And you could argue that, certainly he argues, that Futocracy is rearing its ugly head in a lot of different places. In Congress, with the ability of filibusters to keep governing majorities from actually governing and passing legislation. That's the national level. And then at the local level, the loudest voice the richest voice, the voice that can hire the most annoying lawyer, can stop all sorts of construction projects, whether it's new housing development, a new road, or new energy project. There's a lot of different bottlenecks that we could talk about, but I want to make sure that we get to some questions from the audience. So one more that I want to talk about is construction productivity. This is one that's a little bit more mysterious and one that's actually being researched right now. It's very clear to me that looking at the official statistics, construction productivity is declining, or at least flatlining, while a lot of other, especially commodity producing industries, are seeing rising productivity. So I wonder if you've looked a little bit into this, looking at maybe why construction productivity has flatlined or declined, and that how that might be playing into the lack of housing abundance that we see in America.
Yeah, for sure. The first thing I want to say is just that it's really, really difficult to measure construction productivity, which is why you see a bunch of different statistics floating out there that say it's flatline, that say it's declining. It's just really hard to know how to do that for a bunch of reasons. One is obviously you're trying to figure out whether people are actually paying more for the same thing. So that means productivity is flatline, like we're just paying more money for the same kinds of houses, or are we paying more money because houses are getting better? Like, are they getting more energy efficient? Are they safer from fires?
And they are. Right?
Yes,
I mean, houses are getting bigger. I mean, kitchens are getting nicer, and we have all sorts of new stuff in houses. There's less lead, so it's really difficult to figure out exactly, what is the right deflator to use now that our houses are less likely to poison us. So, and I sorry to interrupt, but you're exactly right. It's very difficult to figure out the nitty gritty of like an official housing or construction productivity metric. Sorry, back to
totally.
you.
No, exactly. And I think it's also another hard thing is you're often trying to figure out like, okay, well, we're also maybe figuring out like how many hours are people working to on a project, and is that going up or down despite not getting a better outcome for people? And like, if anyone who's ever worked in construction, there are tons of subcontractors. Reporting of hours is like really iffy and things like that. And also there's a lot of illegal immigration that's being used, which illegal labor that's being used, which means that often people are not reporting those hours. So there's just a lot of noise in this data. But even despite all of that, most economists are extremely certain that there is some problem going on within construction productivity. And one of the big things that I think, and Brian Potter is this great researcher who's talked about this a lot, and one of the big things I think is going on here is that construction is uniquely kind of a place where cascading failures create a ton of costs, right? Like if someone, and also that most of what you're doing is sequential, right? You have to build part of the house before you can build the windows. Like you can't just like do everything. So anytime you make a mistake earlier on in the process, that can mess up everything that happens downstream. And it's also really costly to undo that. And so what he also finds when he looks into this is that often, with cost outcomes, the median cost overrun is like actually fairly low, but everyone's really afraid of like going over budget, because going under budget saves you a little bit, but going over budget is like extremely really costly. It can be like 10 times as likely to be over budget than you are under budget. And that like creates a lot of problems. And because of that, people are really risk averse in construction, right? Like everyone who's worked in construction knows that like there's a real fear of like making any kind of changes. So like innovation is really hard to do because, it's someone's house. People are going to live in that. It could be, dangerous if something goes wrong in their house, or even just like embarrassing for your company or firm if like, everyone notices there's some weird thing going on with your bridge, like it vibrates too much, or it's just like, it's off kilter or something like that. And undoing it costs a lot of money. And so I think one of the biggest things going on here is just about this specific thing about construction, just having this nature of needing of these cascading cost failures becoming a really big problem. But it is not a monocausal thing at all. There's a lot of things going on here.
Right. I think you summarized that very, very well. It's a really, really complicated space and hard to sort of boil down. But a huge part of it is, number one, cascading costs. You mess up one thing and it delays everything else in the project. And number two, it's really hard to iterate in a way that's cost-free. If you're trying to figure out like a cheaper way to like make socks or like make electronics, oh, we messed up on one sock. Oop, we messed up on one flat screen television. We junk it. You mess up on one house. That's an extremely expensive mistake, and it feeds into the kind of risk aversion that you just described.
Yeah, and so like
Go ahead. Yeah, no.
And each like everyone kinds of things, like, we build a lot of single family homes in the United States, but like each house is kind of like different, right? Like it's different terrain, it's different legal environment. Maybe there's different firms in the area. Each house ends up being different in a way where like standardization is really hard. And like what you notice in generally, and I'm just going to share a couple of graphs right here. What you notice generally is and let me just pull up this slide. Is that industries that are able to,
we got some
I know we have some slides. In places where you see productivity increasing, there are places where you can have standardization, right? Like you're not making a new iPhone every single time you make an iPhone. Like it's the same iPhone and made a million times. But we can see this decline in construction productivity, and it's like pretty stark when you look at other industries here. This other graph also shows kind of the same thing, just looking at construction productivity versus all non-farm productivity. It's like declining pretty significantly when you think about it relative to the rest of the industry. So this is a real problem.
Fantastic graphs. Thanks so much for sharing those. All right, so we have a lot of questions right now, and I want to jump into those. From Marty, we have the question, quote, I'm all in on the idea that we need to build more housing, but how would you ensure that new housing is built in a way that mitigates gentrification and provides a net benefit for marginalized communities? End quote. Jerusalem.
Yeah, I think a couple of things here. I think one is that we have good evidence that not building housing is what exacerbates gentrification. Because, I mean, just using it as an example, I live in Washington, D.C. A lot of young people my age, including myself, have lived in row houses, which used to be family homes that were affordable to like middle class people. And now these have been converted into homes that are basically group houses. So like there's like 6 people living in a group house, and the actual bedrooms are all converted to kind of be more of like a roommate thing rather than a service of family. And the reason the housing stock is changing that way is because higher income, college educated people move into the city. There's not enough housing available to them, maybe in apartment buildings or the types of housing maybe they would immediately prefer. And then what they do is they go and they're now forced to compete with lower income or middle income Americans for the existing housing stock. That drives a ton of displacement. And so that's something where I think is really important. But the second thing I think is important here is that when we often when we talk about this, we have a real bias against the new, but we don't think about how the status quo is so costly to the very communities I think that are harmed the most in situation. So you know, I think that like a new, let's say even if you let's say a new housing development gets built up and it is, you know, a high rise, it's like not going to be affordable to like lower income folks. The effect of that new housing may be something where like it's technically gentrification because you have more wealthier, whiter college educated people moving in. But what that means is those people are freeing up a ton of new housing from where they used to live up. And there's really good papers on this in Finland that look at Finland, that look at Los Angeles, that look at San Francisco. And they find that when the place where people are leaving creates a chain. So they were originally living in like a upper middle income housing unit, and now they're living in a higher income housing unit. And that leaves up space for middle income folks to move into those kinds of units. And this process called filtering is what really creates the possibility for there to be affordable housing for more people. And I also just think that like the opposition to new housing tends to block all kinds of housing. It blocks homeless shelters, it blocks affordable housing, and it creates this weird sense that like gentrification is about like these sorts of aesthetics of new buildings. And I wrote an article last year about how there were a bunch of people annoyed about this new gentrification building that had gone up in Camden, New Jersey, and it turned out to be an affordable housing building built for seniors. But everyone got confused because our entire discourse around gentrification is around blocking progress and blocking change. And so I think that there's a lot of like things going on here. I think it's really important to create stabilization methods so that people are not being forced out of communities they live in, because I think we're so far behind with building now. It's definitely the case that if you were to just get rid of a bunch of zoning regulations, the first thing people are going to try and build are things that accommodate higher income folks. But I think we should think of that as also just a necessary step. You have to build enough housing for everyone. There's no way to just build housing for one segment of lower income people or middle income people. It's just not the way that these markets will work. Rich people will find homes. The question is, do we build enough for poor people to find them too?
That's a fantastic answer. You know, one way that I think about how you think about this issue of gentrification is that when you don't build enough, when there's scarcity, you create zero-sum dynamics. And scarcity creates zero-sum dynamics that can pit classes against each other, that can create inter-class warfare over an extremely finite number of homes. And if you simply build more, then it relaxes a little bit of that zero-sum mentality, such that people who do move out of one area as its average income is rising, have places to move into rather than being merely displaced miles and miles away from where they're working or where they want to live. Andrew has a good question. Andrew asks, quote, do we have any historical analogs for how the government might actively intervene in the domestic housing market? if the US experiences a prolonged period of rising rents and housing shortages. So the housing market as it exists today is an extremely local market. There actually, I've heard some people say, and I don't know if you've said this too, there's really, in a way, no such thing as the US housing market. There are rather 300, 500, however many you want to count, housing markets within the US where the inventory of housing is very different. The average cost of building a home is very different. The local rules and regulations and developer fees, I could keep counting until we're at the end of the episode, are very different. So how do you feel about national policies and the role of the national government in helping to resolve what are fundamentally some local issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a few things that could be done here. On historical analogs, I think one really good one is when we look at how we tied highway funding to raising the drinking age in the US. And what the government did there was like the federal government was not like, oh, we can mandate that all of these local jurisdictions like change their minds on this. But I mean, if we're paying for something that's really important for you and it's related to the issue that we're concerned about, which of course, like drunk driving is a real concern, then we should put some restrictions on the money we're giving. And I think this is even more apt when we think about the transportation dollars that we send out that states and localities really, really rely on for highways, for building new roads, for interchanges, for whatever it is they're trying to do. And at the same time, people in California are taking federal dollars to build communities and build transit unoriented communities that block the ability for people for Iowa to move to California. And I don't think that the federal government should be subsidizing different states, making it impossible for other states to grow and people from other parts of the country to access economic opportunity. So the Biden administration has taken a very small step in this direction. They've tied some small amount of dollars towards creating more dense transit-oriented development. So that means like along new transit corridors, like let's say you're building a new train station. Around that train station, they want to see more density. They want to see that you're upzoning that area to make it possible for more people to live there rather than just keeping it the same place. Because what we know is that when you build a new a train line or you build a new train station in an area, it increases home value significantly. And if you don't make it possible for more people to live there, all you've done is you've given a massive giveaway to existing homeowners who put no effort into making that train line happen and often probably tried to block that train station from existing and are now getting the monetary benefits from it. And I think that those monetary benefits should flow to the community. I was thinking there are a lot, just like shortly here, like there's a lot of really good ideas here about how the federal government can intervene on because one of the biggest problems with housing construction is that it's during booms, people are building a lot during busts, like no one's building housing. And then it creates this really massive problem because there's never sufficient supply. I think the government can intervene here on the financing side in terms of like trying to finance and push development when there are economic downturns. I think there are models that people are coming up with that are really interesting around social housing that could work. I think obviously in this country we've not done a good job of funding our social housing to even the bare minimum. But there are some interesting things being done, especially in my home county, Montgomery County, Maryland, on financing there. And of course, when it comes to government intervention, one of the best things that we do is providing vouchers to people to access to pay for rent. I think that anyone who is below the poverty line or is having difficulty paying their rent, like having the government give them some kind of money makes a lot of sense. But I want to note here, if you just do that and you don't build the supply necessary, you just increase rents for people at the lower end of the income ladder. It's the same number of people now with more money who are now going after the same small dwindling stock of affordable housing. And there's just a giveaway to landowners and to landlords.
I have one follow-up on this because I was thinking, what are the ways in which federal policy most implicates local housing markets? And what about the mortgage interest deduction? Like the US has a very explicit policy of subsidizing mortgages, which encourages people to take on more housing debt, which helps them buy slightly larger houses, which often tend to exist in the suburbs. It doesn't always work out like that. You can have a really, really massive mortgage for an urban condo or apartment. But I think there's lots of policy at the federal level that has somewhat encouraged, you could go back to Eisenhower and the Highway Act, the suburbanization of America, which makes it harder for people, which can discourage urban construction of homes as well. Any way that you've thought about how the MID, the mortgage interest deduction, might also play into some very particular, very unusual American housing issues?
Yeah, I mean, I hate the mortgage interest deduction. I think any single person who works on housing policy thinks it's ridiculous that we're just like giving people more and more
and
money.
Just why? Yeah, just talk a little bit about why you don't like it.
I mean, I think that, I mean, there are a few things here. One is that you identified that it obviously increases demand and it makes it cheaper to build bigger, cheaper to buy bigger houses, which on its own, again, is not a problem if you have a country that's like building sufficient housing stock to accompany that. But what it ends up being is just another one of these tax deductions that helps higher income Americans, pay less taxes when they're already benefiting from being able to access the greatest wealth building opportunity the country gives, which is a home. So it's not that it's like, we shouldn't be helping people buy houses if like that's, if they need help. That seems completely reasonable to me. But I think when you legislate through the tax code like this, essentially what you're doing is you're just giving a big pot of cash to people who are already wealthy.
There are a lot of questions that are skeptical about the idea that more housing availability in a city has anything to do with relieving gentrification. I think that there's this, there's this sort of intuitive sense that, lots of cities have gentrified in a way that doesn't seem to naturally line up with housing availability or no housing availability. They just see that certain neighborhoods have utterly changed, and the people who used to live there, especially non-white people used to live there, and lower income people used to live there, are displaced from communities that used to have a particular identity. So maybe just go one level deeper on why you're persuaded by the case that gentrification and household availability has this connection that you pointed to.
Yeah, I think there's one thing here. Is one thing when we say the word gentrification, often people are talking about so many different ideas in one. You're talking about like the aesthetic differences that might exist as there's more public and private investment. Like maybe there's just more like blue bottle coffees showing up in your neighborhood, or there's like a new Whole Foods, something like that. Maybe you're talking about the fact that the racial composition of the area has changed, or maybe you're talking about the fact that there's now increased displacement. So I think that like, let me just focus in, I think, on the worst of these, which is like the idea that poor people are being forcibly displaced from their and poor people of color being displaced from their communities that they've lived in for a long time. I think there are a couple things here. What people have found out is what displaces people is poverty. So when you look at places that are extremely stagnant, you're not seeing any gentrification there. You see a ton of displacement happening all the time, because when you're poor, you often can't afford your rent. So you're constantly being displaced. Like even if you're living in a place that's like, up and coming, or it's not up and coming, that is the cause of your displacement, is that you don't have access to the money you need in order to make rent, or maybe you have a predatory landlord that's evicting people preemptively constantly in order to make more and more money. I mean, being poor is just extremely costly, especially when there's so little tenant protections at the lower end of the income ladder, and there's very little access to get lawyers. And so we see this displacement is reasonably constant across both neighborhoods that are gentrifying and neighborhoods that are not gentrifying among lower income folks. And so I think the question here is like, when we see that kind of data, what we see is like, the visible change that accompanies that in gentrifying neighborhoods makes it seem pretty obvious, right? Like, oh, there's all these new people coming in. Obviously, they're forcing people out. And in some ways, this can be true. Obviously, if you don't build enough housing, rich people need to move to DC because they get like their new jobs, or they move to New York and they're getting their new jobs. Like they're going to come in and they're going to outbid you on the cost. But the question is, where do we want to put the onus of responsibility here? Is it on someone moving to a new neighborhood and put that kind of personal responsibility for someone moving in as like, you're the gentrifier and therefore you should just opt out? And like, I'm not sure what the end goal here is. Is it like segregation? Is that like white people who are moving into cities should only live in segregated white neighborhoods? It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me what the end goal of that kind of like politics is. And the second thing here is just like, the government is fomenting this kind of scarcity. It is a lie that there's not enough room for everyone here to live together. And it's also something that goes underappreciated, how beneficial it is for all people to have really integrated both economically and racially diverse neighborhoods. I think when we look at cities, like urban landscape in the United States in particular, what you see is not a story largely gentrification. There's actually a really funny study about how like most gentrification scholars live in neighborhoods that are gentrifying, which is why they themselves are so obsessed with the topic. But like
Interesting.
most poor people do not live in gentrified neighborhoods. They live in neighborhoods that get absolutely no investment, no public investment, no private investment. There's barely access to like very basic amenities like sidewalks that are well kept, or stop signs that are like life-saving for people who live in these places. And so the question is, how do we do public and private investment in these communities without driving people out? And the answer is you have to build enough to make sure that when there's increased demand that comes with making a neighborhood nicer, that the people who live there are still able to get access to it. Because a couple things here, as well as just like, if you're a homeowner in a poor area, which again, there are a lot of people who are in lower income neighborhoods who own their homes, it's actually really good for you for home prices to be increasing that place. So how do we make sure that more people in these places maybe own their homes so that they can have access to the gains that a lot of people do? And the second thing is we want to make sure that like the property tax increases don't like wipe these people out either. There's a bunch of like different policies that people can pursue that a lot of places have just chosen not to do because they don't want to solve this problem, and they like the idea implicitly that the blame is not going to the government, it's going to random young college students coming in, when this is obviously a structural problem, not an individual one.
We've gotten a lot of questions about transit and then the intersection of transit and housing. And Alexander Haynes asks a pretty interesting version of this question. He says, I live in rural Taiwan, and while the bus options are, compared to the rest of Taiwan, not great, there's still a fleet of buses, including electric, that get people from rural townships to the city center of the country or the county. What is holding up the US, including smaller counties, from developing transportation routes and a small bus industry, such as Taiwan has, to create jobs and provide economic opportunity? Jerusalem, you've already mentioned the ways in which access to transit can ironically immediately raise the value of a house or the value of an apartment, even though lots of people already living in those houses or apartments might actually object to the construction of anything around them because they don't like the mess, they don't like the sound, they don't like the change. But talk a little bit about this intersection of transit ease and housing abundance.
Yeah, for sure. So obviously, as we talked about up top, there's a bunch of objections to new transit coming in the United States. Part of it is people don't want the construction issues of like train lines or what that will maybe creates disruption in their life. Part of it has been historically an objection to like the types of people who take mass transit. So they don't want poor individuals in their neighborhood. Maybe they don't want access to be granted to people who can't, aren't going to drive in. And so that's been a historical issue as well. But when it comes to buses, I just think there's just been an under appreciation of how good buses are, and like with it just like culturally within the American policy landscape. I think recently bus rapid transit is getting like its moment within transit discourse. And so I think we're seeing more attention to this. I think in general, like people should opt towards buses over transit or over trains in general, because you can move bus lines around a lot. Like, if the form of your community changes, you're not locking in, decades of growth into a specific urban landscape. You can say like, okay, well, now there's demand for this bus line to be moved like to these streets instead. And that's like really not costly to do, as you can keep the same number of buses or whatever. I think that in a lot of places, because America has such a high amount of personal car ownership, you have seen this situation where it has not been necessary to accommodate the middle class on public transportation, because the middle class Americans are so wealthy when you look at compared to the rest of the world that they can afford personal cars. This is not obviously wholly explanatory. There are a lot of places with high personal car ownership rates that have access to bus lines, but I do think it's a big part of the story is like when we got personal cars, it was before we started really investing in buses.
How much of everything that we're talking about, and a lot of what we're talking about, I think fits under this penumbra of nimbyism, not in my backyard, right? A preference for things to stay the same where I live. May it live forever in a kind of frozen amber. I don't want anything to change. I don't want new people in here. I don't want prices to change. I just want everything to be as placid as a still pond. How much of that do you think is, this is a bit of a more deep and existential question, how much of that is human nature, just a preference for the familiar, a preference for things not to change in a way that feels rapid and scary and out of the ordinary? And how much of it is specific to America? Because a theme that I'm picking up in the last few questions that I've asked you, and a lot of the questions that we're getting, go back to the fact that America somewhat uniquely subsidizes mortgage interest rates. America rather uniquely, built out the highways rather than invest in local transit. America has an incredibly close romantic relationship with the car, the automobile, that a lot of similarly rich countries, for a variety of reasons in Southeast Asia, in Europe, don't necessarily have. So when you think about the problem of NIMBYism, to what extent do you think it is human nature versus American nature?
I think NIMBYism is human nature. I think that there's like very common that when you, you move to a community that you like, you want it to kind of, you want to have some kind of control over that. You don't want it to change. But I think that there's like the problem with NIMBYism is not that feeling. The problem with NIMBYism is because most people, right, have never been to a zoning board meeting. Like the vast majority of people have never been to a zoning board meeting. They do not know what developments are being proposed usually in their communities. Like maybe they'll become salient if something like really big changes and they might like put a yard sign in their lawn, but they're not really going to go and like agitate. This is a very small slice of individuals who are really like getting lawyers. And that's, I think, one of the biggest problems. Like it's so small, yet it has such an outsized impact. And I think the thing that's different is how do our political institutions respond? And I'm just going to do a quick anecdote about how Copenhagen responded to some NIMBYs. So they're building transit in Copenhagen, and they get some objections from a local, I think, like homeowners association equivalent that they have over there about like how construction's going on really late. It's like violating laws. It's creating all these problems. And so, like America, the government responds and it like halts construction. I think construction gets halted for about 7 months. And then what happens is something that's different that doesn't happen in America, is that the Danes pass a law. They pass a law that says, okay, this is the amount of noise that's allowed to happen. This is when you're allowed to actually work these hours. And this is like the agreement. And this is how much homeowners have to be compensated. And now continue construction. And so the thing that happens here is that the Danes ended the debate. They're like, okay, there is a debate. There's a pause that we had. And then we're ending it. This is the decision. Yes, there are going to be some costs on both sides here that are borne, but we're just going to be moving forward now. In the US, a similar problem that like this would end up in just years of litigation in which there's like almost no confidence that you have that the government's going to do that kind of like step back cost benefit analysis. Okay, this might piss off some of the homeowners, but that's fine. Like we're going to have to like make this kind of decision. Here's a reasonable amount of money that you should be paid in order to compensate you for the change in your life that's you're going to undergo as we're building this, because there's recognition of the massive benefit that transit's going to have to the country's GDP. And I think that that's kind of like the big problem here. It's not like NIMBYism in America is particularly, I think, just so utterly unique or out of the norm for human nature. It's that our political institutions have no idea how to handle it.
And what would be exactly, like if you're going to write like a white paper or even an article for The Atlantic, if I'm talking about a white paper, we're not a think tank. If you're going to write an article for The Atlantic about like how to import this Copenhagen idea to America, like what would you call it? Like if someone wants to be like an advocate for this sort of thinking, right? This kind of adjudication over a local debate about construction, and then someone decides, here's what's going to happen, here's how the parties are going to be compensated, and now move forward. What do we call this?
I think that I don't know if you're talking about YIMBYism. YIMBYism is the big idea.
What's like institutionally, like what would whatever a city like Los Angeles need that it doesn't currently have, like legally, structurally, in order to respond to NIMBY issues the way that Copenhagen responds?
Yeah, I think the big thing here is that other countries do not have our level of localism. They do not have the level of pushing down these extremely important decisions down to such a local level. And the reason why this is important is because at the very local level, so few people are involved in voting, and your determination of whether or not your local officials are doing well often has very little to do with like macroeconomic trends. Like I don't blame regular people don't blame their mayor for whether or not like houses are affordable or whether there's like, their jobs are really good or like whether their wages are high. They like say, oh, the people who I blame for that are maybe like at the state level or they're at the federal level. It's just not how you conceptualize the role of local government. But the real problem is that we don't conceptualize that. So we don't hold local officials accountable for those kinds of decisions. And they have so much power over them because they can block new development pretty easily in response to homeowner complaints. And so I think the really big thing here is like America needs to deal with the fact that we need to be moving the levers of power on progress away from local levels that do not have the ability, time, money, or political capital in order to actually enact an abundance agenda on housing or on transit or whatever else that we need.
I think all the time, I'm obsessed with the question of like, how do you unlock people's value in order to turn them from NIMBYs, don't build, into YIMBYs? Yes, Bill, because I have a pretty deep-seated, maybe controversial idea that no one changes their values. Their values are like this like fixed menu inside of them, but their values can be played. Like the keyboard exists and you can like play whatever song you want on it. So that, for example, you think about two different values that someone might have when it comes to construction. Value number one is I don't want anything to change. I have a preference toward the familiar. That is a value that I have. Another value that people have is I want a better life for my children. I want a better life for all people in the future. And that's a value that is accented in or accentuated in all sorts of policy. There are people that are childless or whose kids go to private school who nonetheless pay local taxes. Where do those local taxes go? A lot of them go to public education. Like you don't necessarily see a lot of moderates or certainly a lot of liberals protesting every 6 months about how, oh, it's totally unfair that I'm paying all of these local taxes for the public education system in my city. No, it's just understood that to a certain extent, the kids in this metro are our kids, the collective kids. And so of course it's okay to pay for the future. To a certain extent, I see this in Social Security as well. People give up money in their payroll taxes. Why? Why are you taking money from me? It's not going to me. Well, yes, but it's going to fund this system that is a part of our values. We want to reduce senior poverty. We want to prepare seniors for when they are leaving their jobs to not live in destitution. So we are willing to think intergenerationally in public school taxes, in Social Security. I want to make people think intergenerationally in housing, to recognize that when we don't build today, we are hurting the children of tomorrow. Maybe that tomorrow is literally tomorrow, maybe it's in 20 years. But I'm obsessed with this question of how do we get people to how do we accentuate the value that makes them YIMBYs? And I just wonder if you've done any thinking on this. This is our very last question. And again, I apologize for ending on a difficult philosophical question, but how do you think about like accenting people's values to support the kind of policies that you find so morally necessary?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a different perspective on this. Perhaps it's one that's a little bit more pessimistic on human nature than yours is, Derek. I just think that like there's a couple things. One is I don't think that we fix this problem via like a mass movement change. As I mentioned before, there are very few people who are really actually like powerful NIMBYs in their community. I think this is about convincing mostly technocrats and policymakers like that we need to change these rules. I mean, we look at California, there has not been like like the YIMBY movement is obviously big in California, but it's like extremely small relative to the state. What they've done is they've convinced a lot of really powerful people that they're like actually just correct on the issue, and you're not gonna be able to solve housing affordability unless you do that. So that's one thing. The second thing is I think in terms of actual persuasion of individuals, I don't think we need to like convince them that it's for someone else. It's for you. Like it's ruining your life when you don't allow enough housing to be built. And I think a lot of times, like people have difficulty thinking about their future selves, but like that's what we're doing. Like we're robbing our future selves. And I take this example of seniors who are often a lot of times the people who are blocking this are like older individuals who like their community. They're often much more averse to change than young people are by nature of where they are in their lives. There are so many seniors. I mean, AARP talks about this issue all the time. There's so many seniors who are locked into housing that is so inaccessible for them that they can't even go to the second floor because they're now disabled by age. They now have a situation where like maybe like there's not even like a bedroom on the first floor they're using. People are like sleeping on their couches instead. And the reason why they don't just move, when often a lot of people have like home equity in their house, you're just like, why don't you just sell your house and like go to a different place, like downsize or find a place that's more accessible? And the answer is they want to still stay in their communities. So they have for their whole life opposed housing in their communities that would have serviced them now in old age, that now when they need a multifamily apartment building in the area or a senior's home in the area that's built that is like going to be smaller housing, that maybe that's more flat, that's only one story rather than multiple stories that they can't access anymore. I mean, these kinds of housing are necessary for them in their own lifetime. And it's not just for them, right? Like, it's not even just like, okay, like, maybe you're, you have enough money, not worried about that. Maybe it's just for the fact that you want to make more money. You want to put like an additional dwelling unit on your yard. That means like a mother-in-law suite, or you want to convert your garage into a, an apartment so that you can either maybe give it to your kid who needs housing right now, or you want to use the extra money to to help pay for increased property taxes or just make more money for whatever reason that you might need it for medical expenses without moving, it is illegal in most of America on your own property for you to convert your garage into an apartment. That's illegal in your own house. And I think it's one of those things where it's just like absurd from like an American individual's perspective, where like we have a pretty strong idea about private property rights, where when it comes to housing, we have this idea that like it's fine for your neighbor to basically be like the homeowners association president from hell and not let you do what you need to do on your property to do what's best for your family, for your own financial security. So I think the best way to convince people is not trying to like make them care more about other people, but make it clear to them that these policies are ruining their future. There's a high likelihood that every person at some point gets disabled as they go into age. There's a high point at some point where you'll need some sort of new income flowing into your house. Do you want government regulations to be the thing that's stopping you from accessing that economic opportunity, or do you want that to be accessible to all people?
It's brilliant. It's funny. I have this like optimistic view of human nature. I'm like, we have to convince people to be generous, and you're like, no, we have to convince people that their selfishness should encourage them to join our side. Whether listeners or viewers want to be generous or selfish, I do hope that you thank Jerusalem Demzis for this really fantastic overview of housing abundance in America. That's all we have time for today. If you missed this one, we'll be back. We're doing this every second Tuesday of the month going forward. You can read more from Jerusalem and me at theatlantic.com and in our print issue. If you enjoyed this conversation and you want more of The Atlantic, you can support our journalism by becoming a subscriber. You can visit our website for more info on how to do that. And finally, the Atlantic Festival is upcoming. And after hosting the Atlantic Festival virtually for the past 2 years, 2022 will be the first year that is available to both virtual and in-person visitors in Washington, D.C. It's happening this September. Learn to sign up to learn about how to register by clicking the link that is currently in your Zoom chat. Thank you very much. Again, thank you to Jerusalem, and we will see you again next month. Bye-bye.
Bye.